He was born into the kind of family that Rome noticed but did not yet need. The Annius family held wealth, senatorial rank, and a reputation for reliability. The respectable background of men who served the empire without threatening it. Marcus Annius Verus came into that world on April 26, 121 AD, in a Rome that was, by most measures, at its height. Hadrian sat on the throne. The borders held. The legions were disciplined. There was no obvious crisis demanding a savior, and no reason to look at a newborn in a comfortable Roman household and see anything other than another senator in the making. His father died when Marcus was young. Enough has been written about that loss to fill the margins, but Marcus himself recorded very little about it. What he did record, in the only writing of his that survives, was gratitude for his grandfather, who taught him to be gentle, for his mother, who modelled frugality in a class that had every reason to indulge. He grew up in a household shaped by restraint. Whether that was temperament or instruction is difficult to separate. Probably both. What is clear is that he was drawn to philosophy early and seriously, not as an aristocratic affectation. Roman elites often flirted with Greek thought as a mark of culture, but with the kind of commitment that concerned the people around him. He slept on a hard mat. He wore rough cloaks. He sat with Stoic tutors long past the hours that social obligation required. One of those tutors, Apollonius of Chalcedon, and would later be described by Marcus as a man who showed him that it was possible to live as a Stoic without being rigid, that consistency and flexibility were not opposites. That distinction would take decades to fully understand, and Marcus would spend most of his life trying to work it out in practice. Hadrian noticed him when Marcus was around 6 years old. The emperor had a habit of identifying useful people early, and something about the boy registered. He called him Verissimus, the most truthful, a nickname that carries more weight the longer you consider it. Rome in the 2nd century ran on performance, on the careful management of public image and political theatre. Its court was populated by men who had refined the art of saying what needed to be said. As an emperor who called a child most truthful was not simply paying a compliment, he was identifying something that either charmed him or unsettled him, possibly both. By the time Marcus was 17, Hadrian was dying and needed to arrange what came next. He adopted Antoninus Pius as his heir, but attached a condition. Antoninus had to adopt both Marcus and a young man named Lucius Verus. The dynasty was being constructed 2 generations forward simultaneously. Marcus had no say in this. He was studying. He was, by multiple accounts, content with a life of books and instruction and the kind of quiet interior work that Stoicism demands. That life ended the moment Hadrian's plan was formalized. He was no longer simply a promising student from a good family. He was the designated future of Rome. There is a passage in the Meditations, written decades later, where Marcus reflects on accepting the role fate assigns without complaint. Scholars debate which specific circumstances he had in mind at any given moment, but it is reasonable to read that passage and think of a 17-year-old being told, without negotiation, that his life now belonged to something larger than himself. Whether Marcus made peace with that early, or arrived at peace slowly, through years of effort, is something the text never quite resolves. What the historical record does show is that he did not resist. He stepped into the new shape of his life with the compliance of someone who had already decided that compliance was not the same as surrender. He continued studying. He continued writing. He took on new responsibilities and bore them without apparent resentment, and at least none that survived in the sources. And he watched Antoninus Pius govern, carefully, patiently, for longer than Marcus might have expected, learning something in that long wait that no tutor had been able to teach him directly. Antoninus Pius ruled for 23 years, and almost nothing dramatic happened. That is not an oversight in the historical record. It is the record. His reign is notable primarily for its absence of catastrophe. No major wars, no significant revolts, no plagues, no purges of the senatorial class. Historians of the period sometimes struggle to find much to say about it, which, depending on how you understand governance, is either a damning assessment or the highest possible praise. Marcus watched all of it. He watched how Antoninus handled the Senate with deference without being weak. He watched how he managed the provinces without micromanaging their governors. He watched how a man could hold enormous power and wear it so lightly that most of the empire simply got on with its business. This was an education in a specific kind of competence, the kind that does not announce itself. Marcus was given administrative responsibilities gradually. He held the quaestorship, then the consulship, took on legal work, sat in on imperial proceedings. He was being introduced to the machinery of the state at a pace that reflected both his adoptive father's confidence in him and his own measured temperament. He did not push for more. He did not position himself publicly as the heir apparent in ways that might unsettle Antoninus or invite political competition. He remained, in the eyes of Rome, at exactly what the situation required: present, capable, and patient. Meanwhile, he kept writing. The private journals that would eventually be compiled under the title Meditations were not yet what they would become on the northern frontier. Those later entries carry a different weight, but the habit was forming. Marcus wrote to hold himself accountable. The entries read less like reflection and more like instruction directed inward, a man correcting his own thinking before it could calcify into assumption. He catalogued his failings with more energy than his achievements. He reminded himself, repeatedly, not to be flattered, not to be distracted, not to confuse the appearance of virtue with the practice of it. There is something worth pausing on in that. So a man with every social incentive to believe in his own exceptional nature spent his private hours arguing himself out of that belief. Whether that produced genuine humility or a very sophisticated performance of it is a question the Meditations raises without answering. The text is honest about the struggle, but silent on whether the struggle was ever won. His relationship with Antoninus appears to have been one of genuine affection. Marcus writes about him with a specificity that goes beyond formal tribute. He admires the way Antoninus deliberated slowly on difficult decisions, the way he dismissed flattery without making enemies of the people offering it, the way he never acted from vanity when reason was available as an alternative. These are not the observations of a man cataloguing political lessons. They read like the notes of someone who found in his adoptive father something he recognized and wanted to preserve in himself. What Marcus could not fully learn from observation alone was what governance felt like under pressure. Antoninus had managed to avoid most of the conditions that produced that kind of knowledge. The empire he handed Marcus was stable, financially sound, and administratively coherent. It was also, though no one fully recognized it at the time, near the outer edge of a long period of relative calm. The infrastructure of Roman security, the legions, the frontier arrangements, the diplomatic relationships that kept the borders quiet, had been maintained but not seriously tested during Antoninus's reign. What lay just beyond the threshold of Marcus's accession was a different kind of world, and one that would demand not the patient observation of a long apprenticeship, but something harder and less controllable. Marcus turned 40 in 161 AD. Antoninus was in declining health. The transfer of power, when it came, was orderly, as everything under Antoninus had been. And Marcus, who had spent 2 decades learning how to govern a Rome that cooperated, was about to discover what it required to govern one that did not. He took the throne and immediately complicated it. The legal and political architecture of the succession gave Marcus sole authority. Antoninus had designated him, the Senate confirmed him, and the mechanisms of Roman imperial power were prepared to function with one man at their center. Marcus set that aside within days. He elevated Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, younger, less experienced, temperamentally his opposite, to the rank of co-emperor. Full imperial power, shared equally, with no precedent in Roman history to justify it and no political crisis demanding it. It was a voluntary act, and Rome noticed. The explanations historians have offered range from genuine fraternal loyalty to careful political calculation. Lucius was popular with the Praetorian Guard, which was not a group any new emperor could afford to alienate. Sharing power was also, in a sense, philosophically consistent with everything Marcus had written about the dangers of concentrated authority, though it would be too neat to suggest he was simply living out a Stoic principle. The more likely truth is that several considerations converged, and Marcus acted on all of them simultaneously. He was that kind of thinker. What followed left little time for reflection on the decision. Within months of the accession, the eastern frontier fractured. The Parthian king Vologases moved against the Roman client kingdom of Armenia, installed his own candidate on the throne, and then destroyed a Roman legion sent to respond. It was a direct challenge, calculated and deliberate. At roughly the same time, pressure began building on the Danube from Germanic tribes testing the northern border. Two separate crises, on opposite ends of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, arriving almost simultaneously in the first year of a new reign. Marcus sent Lucius east. The decision has attracted scrutiny ever since. Lucius had no serious military record. He was known for his love of games, spectacle, and the kind of court pleasures that Marcus personally found wasteful. He was charming in ways Marcus was not, and effective in the social registers that military command partly depends on: the ability to inspire loyalty, to project confidence, to make men feel their sacrifices are seen. Marcus likely understood this. He also sent with Lucius the general Gaius Avidius Cassius, who had the actual military competence the campaign required. The command structure was designed so that Lucius could represent imperial authority while experienced men executed strategy. Whatever Marcus thought of his brother's limitations, he arranged the situation so that those limitations would not determine the outcome. He remained in Rome, managing the administrative consequences of a war being fought 1,000 miles away. The demands were considerable. Supplying a major eastern campaign required financial coordination across multiple provinces. The Senate had to be maintained as a functional partner. Legal cases that Antoninus had left unresolved required decisions. Marcus worked through them with the same deliberate attention he had brought to everything since adolescence. Moving between the demands of empire and, in whatever hours remained, the private writing that no one around him fully understood the extent of. The Eastern campaign ultimately succeeded. By 166 AD, Roman forces had pushed deep into Parthian territory, sacked the royal capital of Ctesiphon, and restored Roman influence over Armenia. Lucius returned to Rome in triumph. The celebrations were genuine, the military achievement real. Marcus shared the victory titles without apparent resentment, for standing beside a man who had commanded in name while others commanded in practice, and treating the outcome as what it was: a problem resolved. But the legions came home with something that no triumph could process. Among the men returning from Mesopotamia was a pathogen that Roman medicine had no framework for, and Roman infrastructure had no way to contain. It moved through the army camps first, then along the trade routes, then into the cities. By the time its scale became undeniable, it had already crossed boundaries that no general had thought to defend. What Marcus had managed to stabilize in the first years of his reign was about to be subjected to a pressure entirely unlike anything Antoninus had prepared him for, and entirely unlike anything he had prepared himself for in 20 years of private writing. And the plague did not arrive with any of the drama that crisis usually announces itself with in the historical record. There was no single moment of recognition, no imperial decree marking the day Rome understood what it was dealing with. It moved the way disease moves, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. The physician Galen, who was present in Rome during the early years of the outbreak, left clinical descriptions detailed enough that modern epidemiologists have used them to argue with reasonable confidence that the Antonine Plague was smallpox, fever, pustules, inflammation of the throat, black diarrhea in the final stages. Galen recorded what he saw with the detachment of a man committed to observation, but even his notes carry a register of scale that goes beyond clinical interest. Why he was watching something that did not have a precedent in Roman medical literature. At its peak, ancient sources record death tolls of 2,000 people per day in the city of Rome alone. The figure is likely an exaggeration in its precision, as such figures from antiquity tend to be, but the underlying reality it points toward is not. The plague ran for the better part of 2 decades, flaring and receding without fully disappearing, returning in force in 189 AD, long after Marcus was dead. Estimates of total mortality across the empire range from 5 to 10 million people. Some historians argue higher. The demographic, economic, and military consequences restructured Roman society in ways that would not be fully visible for another generation. Marcus governed through all of it. What that required, practically, that was a continuous process of improvisation within systems that had not been designed for sustained attrition. The army was the most immediate problem. The northern legions, already stretched by the Danubian pressure that had been building since the accession, were losing men to disease, faster than the standard recruitment mechanisms could replace them. Marcus responded by opening military service to groups that Roman tradition had kept at the margins: gladiators, freed slaves, the Germanic tribesmen from the very peoples pressing on the frontier. It was pragmatic, and it was controversial. The decision reflected something consistent in Marcus's governance: a willingness to prioritize function over form when form had stopped serving its purpose. The treasury deteriorated in parallel, and war and plague together created a fiscal pressure that provincial taxation could not absorb. In 167 AD, Marcus auctioned imperial property in the Forum of Trajan: furniture, artworks, palace ornaments, objects that had accumulated through generations of imperial accumulation, rather than levy new taxes on a population already destabilized by disease. The gesture was partly theatrical, as most acts of imperial self-restraint are, but the financial reasoning behind it was real. He needed money, and he chose the source of it carefully. Through all of this, the meditations continued. The entries from this period are not a record of the plague in any documentary sense. Marcus does not describe it directly, does not list its consequences, does not write about policy. What he writes about is the management of the self under conditions of persistent difficulty, about not being swept into despair by what cannot be controlled, about the difference between events and responses to events, a distinction Stoic philosophy had been elaborating for centuries, but which takes on different weight when the man writing it is responsible for the survival of millions of people and visibly failing to prevent their deaths. Galen left Rome during the worst of it. He was called back eventually, appointed as physician to Marcus's son Commodus, and returned to the imperial orbit. But the initial departure stands. Marcus, who wrote at length about duty and the obligation to remain at one's post regardless of personal cost, chose not to compel his most important medical mind to stay. Whether that reflects pragmatism, I'd respect for Galen's autonomy, or something more ambivalent, is not recorded. The Meditations offer no comment on it. What they do offer, in passage after passage from these years, is the image of a man attempting to govern his own interior with the same attention he brought to the empire. Whether the two projects were succeeding at comparable rates is a question the text leaves, with some precision, unanswered. Rome was not where the war was, and increasingly, Rome was not where Marcus was either. From the late 160s onward, the center of imperial gravity shifted north. The Marcomanni, a Germanic confederation occupying territory roughly corresponding to modern Bohemia, had been probing the Danube frontier with increasing confidence. The Quadi, their neighbors to the east, moved in coordination. Behind them, and partly driving them, and it was a larger pattern of tribal displacement, populations pushing against populations, a slow westward pressure whose origins stretched far beyond the frontier Marcus was responsible for defending. He could address the symptom. The cause was beyond any Roman solution. He established his command base at Carnuntum, a legionary fortress on the Danube in what is now Austria, and spent the better part of a decade operating from the frontier rather than the capital. The administrative machinery of Rome continued functioning in his absence. He had capable prefects, an established bureaucracy, and had spent 20 years learning how that machinery worked. But the decision to remain in the north, rather than manage the wars from a distance, was deliberate. Marcus understood, or came to understand, that the Danubian campaigns required the kind of continuous attention that remote governance could not provide. The wars themselves were grinding in a way that the eastern campaign against Parthia had not been. The Parthian conflict, for all its scale, had a recognizable shape: defined territory, a state enemy with a capital that could be sacked, a diplomatic framework within which resolution was possible. The northern wars had none of that. The Germanic tribes did not hold cities. They dispersed, regrouped, crossed the river at points where Roman surveillance was thin, retreated into forest terrain that Roman tactical doctrine was not designed for. Every military success created a temporary boundary that the next season could erase. It was during these campaigns, in the military tents and winter quarters of the Danube frontier, that some of the most frequently quoted passages in the Meditations were written. The manuscript tradition preserves the locations for several books, among them references to Carnuntum and the Granua River. Marcus was writing philosophy in a war zone, and the fact that this requires comment says something about how completely the two aspects of his life had become inseparable. He was not writing despite the campaigns. He was writing through them, using the discipline of the text to maintain an interior coherence that the exterior circumstances were continuously working to erode. The so-called rain miracle occurred during a battle against the Quadi, probably around 172 AD. The Roman column, surrounded and facing heat exhaustion, was saved by a sudden and violent storm that disoriented the enemy and provided the legions with water. Ancient sources attributed it variously to prayer, to the intervention of an Egyptian magician in the Roman ranks, and to the gods responding to Marcus's personal piety. Christian writers later claimed the soldiers responsible for the prayer were Christian. Marcus recorded no version of events. The column on his forum in Rome depicts the miracle in stone. The rain god shone overhead, the enemy scattered beneath him. What Marcus actually believed about what happened that day is not available to us. What is available is the surrounding context. A man who wrote, somewhere in these same years, that external events carry only the meaning we assign them, and that the task is to act well, regardless of outcome, was simultaneously being commemorated for a divine intervention that suggested the gods were monitoring his campaigns personally, and the gap between his private philosophy and his public iconography was one he navigated without apparent discomfort, or at least without recorded complaint. The empire required certain symbolic languages. Marcus spoke them when necessary and wrote something different in private. By the mid-70s, the military situation had stabilized enough that a political resolution seemed possible. Marcus had pushed the Marcomanni back across the Danube and was beginning to consider the shape of a more permanent settlement, possibly the incorporation of new territory as Roman provinces, an ambition that would have extended the frontier further than it had ever reached in the north. Then a general named Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor in the east, and everything Marcus had built in the north had to wait. The revolt of Avidius Cassius lasted 3 months and 6 days before his own officers killed him and sent his head to Marcus. Cassius had been one of the most capable generals in the Roman army, the same man Marcus had sent east with Lucius Verus to manage the Parthian campaign, the operational mind behind its success. He had governed Syria with enough competence that Marcus had granted him an unusually broad authority over the eastern provinces. The trust was real, and so was the betrayal. In 175 AD, apparently acting on a false report that Marcus had died, Cassius declared himself emperor and secured the support of Egypt and much of the Eastern Empire within days. Whether he genuinely believed Marcus was dead, or used that report as convenient cover for ambitions he had been cultivating quietly, as is something the sources argue about without resolution. Marcus's response was, by the standards of Roman political crisis, restrained to the point of being strange. He moved east with his army, but wrote ahead to the Senate, asking that no senators be executed in his absence, and that Cassius's supporters be treated with clemency. When Cassius was killed before the two men could meet, Marcus expressed what appear to have been genuine regrets, not for Cassius, but for the loss of an opportunity to demonstrate that a civil war could end without retribution. He pardoned most of those involved. He burned Cassius's correspondence without reading it, reportedly to avoid knowing which senators had written to support the usurper. Whether that was wisdom or theatre is a distinction that may not have mattered to Marcus. The outcome was the same either way. He returned to Rome, then went back north. The Danubian situation had not resolved itself in his absence, and the political settlement he had been constructing before the revolt still needed completing. His wife Faustina died in 175 AD, somewhere in Asia Minor during the Eastern journey, and Marcus had her deified, the standard imperial tribute, and wrote about her in the Meditations, with an affection that sits quietly against the accusations Roman gossip had spent decades directing at her. The ancient sources, hostile to Faustina in ways that appear to track political rather than personal grievances, accused her of infidelities and even of encouraging Cassius's revolt. Marcus never acknowledged those accusations in anything that survives. He mourned her and moved on, which was itself a kind of answer. What does not fit neatly into the picture of a philosopher governing wisely is Commodus. Marcus had a biological son, which none of the 5 emperors preceding him had possessed at the point of succession. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Each had adopted their heir, selecting for capacity rather than blood. The system had produced a century of competent governance and was, by the time Marcus inherited it, the closest thing Rome had to a working model of rational succession. Marcus understood this history. He had lived inside its results. And in 177 AD, he named Commodus co-emperor, and in 180 AD, dying on the Danubian frontier, he left him the empire entire. Commodus was 19. The historical record of his reign, the erratic behavior, the neglect of governance, adds the grandiose self-identification with Hercules, the eventual assassination by a conspiracy that included members of his own household, is extensive and largely consistent across sources that otherwise disagree about many things. He was not the worst emperor Rome produced, but he ended the period of sustained competent governance that Marcus had both benefited from and extended, and he did it quickly. The question of why Marcus made this choice has occupied historians for as long as the question has existed. He had capable men around him. He had time, at least some of it, to arrange a different outcome. The Stoic framework he had spent his life constructing offered clear guidance on the difference between what is ours and what is not, between attachment to outcomes we cannot control and action directed by reason. Naming a son emperor because he was a son is precisely the kind of decision that framework was designed to interrogate. And Marcus made it anyway. He made it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, which makes it harder, not easier, to explain. The Meditations contain no entry that addresses it directly. The silence is complete, and in that completeness, oddly eloquent. A man who wrote about almost every failure of judgment he could identify in himself left no record of wrestling with the one decision that history would find most difficult to defend. Whether that silence represents certainty, grief, or something he could not bring himself to examine, the text does not say. It simply ends, as Marcus himself would, on the frontier, still moving forward, still unfinished. He died on March 17th, 180 AD, near the Danube. The sources disagree on the exact location. Vindobona, Sirmium, somewhere in that cold northern corridor he had spent the last decade of his life moving through. The disagreement is fitting. He had not been a man of fixed places. The empire he left was intact. The borders held, more or less. The administrative structures he had inherited from Antoninus and maintained through plague, war, and revolt were still functioning. By the conventional measures of imperial success, his reign qualified. What came after it was not his fault in any simple sense, and not entirely his fault in any complex one either. History has never fully settled that accounting, and probably should not. The Meditations disappeared for centuries. They survived through the kind of accident that most ancient texts did not survive through. Copied by monks who found them useful, preserved in monasteries whose primary interest was not Roman philosophy, resurfacing in the medieval period without anyone quite understanding what they had. The first printed edition appeared in 1558, nearly 1400 years after Marcus died. It was read by Renaissance scholars, then by Enlightenment thinkers, then by everyone who came after them, looking for a framework that held up under pressure. What they found was a man arguing with himself, not performing wisdom, not constructing a legacy, not writing for the audience that eventually arrived. The text reads the way it does, because it was never meant to be read. That may be the most accurate thing about it. The 2,000 years of readers have returned to a Roman emperor's private notes, not because he was powerful, but because the struggle recorded in those pages, to act well, to think clearly, to remain honest about the distance between who you are and who you intend to be, has not dated in any way that matters.